joining us. You've just seen the video. Frankly, the numbers are absolutely terrorizing. Good morning here from Davos, and welcome to those of you joining us on Bloomberg QuickTake via Twitter. Now, our subject today is one of enormous scale but microscopic complexity. The question is simple enough. How can we break free from single-use plastics? Now, we will be conducting a poll today, which all of you here in the room can actually participate throughout the session. If you would like to vote, it's very simple. You go online, and this is what you do. WEF.ch, #vote. Our poll, there are two today, and we'll get through it in the session. How often do you use single plastic or single-use packaging items such as plastic bottles, coffee cups, food containers? And the second question is, how likely are you to make changes in your consumption habits or in the way your business and organization operates? Let's now get to the people really you want to hear from. Joining us here, Melati Wijsen. She's the founder of Bye Plastic Bags initiative, which has successfully banned plastic bags, straws, and styrofoam on her home island of Bali as of last year. Niinami, he is chief executive of Suntory Holdings, the world's third biggest whiskey maker. He intends to replace all plastic bottle materials and with recycled and plant-derived material by 2030. Akira Sakano, she's the chair of the board of directors at Zero Waste Academy, a nonprofit based in the town of Kamikatsu, and Al Gore served as vice president of the United States from 1993 to 2001. He serves as chairman and co-founder of sustainable investment firm Generation Investment Management. I'm Francine Lacqua, anchor for Bloomberg TV and radio. Vice President, let me actually kick off with you. We're talking about how the world can break free from single-use plastics. What happens if we don't?
Well, first of all, thank you, Francine, and it's an honor to be a part of this panel, and I look forward to learning from my fellow panelists here. We have to break this habit that has been growing. We've doubled the use of plastics in the world in the last 20 years, and we're poised to double it again in the next 15 to 20 years. Recently, there was an expedition to the deepest part of the ocean, the Marianas Trench. And at the bottom of the deepest part of the ocean, they collected these extraordinary and unusual life forms that have adapted to live there. And inside them, they found plastic. It's everywhere now. And as one of the graphics in your preliminary video showed, and many are familiar with this statistic, at current rates, by 2050, the weight of the plastic in the ocean will exceed the weight of all the fish in the oceans. And it's entering the food chain with unknown health consequences. So what can we do? Well, a price on carbon, which is proposed solution number one for the climate crisis, even though very difficult to enact in so many jurisdictions, would also cut down on plastics. But for the most part, this will involve regulatory measures and laws passed jurisdiction by jurisdiction. Of course, individuals can help, but you know, in a debate like this, it's important not to leave a feeling with people listening that it's up to them individually. What they do matters, but what they do as citizens and voters in political systems that are considering measures that will actually be effective, that's even more important. Let me finish with one quick story. In my country, the Mississippi River runs down the middle of the United States, and in the lower Mississippi River, there is a region known as Cancer Alley. It is largely populated by people of color, low income, and it is filled with petrochemical facilities. Petrochemicals are the third largest emitter of industrial greenhouse gases. The cancer rate is many times larger there. There's a brand new proposal from Formosa Plastics to build a giant new plastics facility there with 14 different facilities, emitting the equivalent of new greenhouse gases, the equivalent to 3 1,000 megawatt dirty coal plants, further imposing an even heavier burden of cancer on the people who live in that area. I will be there in a couple of months with a number of other people trying to rally opposition to this facility. You are going to see a mass movement around the world aimed at these proposals to further increase plastics production. And one thing people don't know is that the fracking of natural gas produces ethyl in much higher percentages than the old production of oil and gas, and that makes plastic production even more profitable. So with transportation fuels going down, with electric vehicles, with solar and wind pushing the market for fossil fuel generated electricity going down, there is a hunger to make up that lost revenue by further increasing the production of plastics, and we cannot allow it.
Melati, when did you realize that you had to put an end to this? You're 19 years old.
I am, yes, but when I started, I was 12 years old and my sister was 10. And, you know, it didn't take a very long time for us growing up on the island of Bali to just see plastic ending up in places that it shouldn't. And, you know, in the video before, there's a lot of statistics, and numbers don't really stay with me, but I wanted to tell you a story of how those numbers on pages or statistics really turn into reality. We recently had a dinner, and we live close to the beach. We bought fish from the local fishermen, and we prepared the fish. We were about 10 people around the table, and we put it up on the table, the fish. We opened it up, and right there on our dinner table, out came bits of plastic that were as thick as my nail. So this is where we're seeing plastic, single-use plastic, enter our daily lives. And it's not in the future, it's happening right now. And the thing that I really liked about this panel was that we were addressing breaking free from single-use plastic. Take a plastic bag, for example. The average time that we use it is 30 minutes, and then we throw it away. And that's the exact problem. We're throwing it away without understanding where the away really is. So yeah, I campaigned for the last 6 years together with my team to ban single-use plastic bags. After 6 years campaigning, we had that ban come into place. But we also know that this is just the beginning. This really opened the discussion for the larger, bigger picture of waste management, waste separation, waste collection. How do we engage governments, businesses, the plastic industry to get involved in creating a more circular economy?
Akira, how much campaigning and how much, you know, have you had to fight actually to get some of these things done?
Actually, I work with small communities back in Japan that is aiming to be zero waste community. So we, of course, had to involve local government, local businesses, all the residents in the area. So mapping out all the stakeholders and how to onboard them in that context is definitely a challenge. Yet once we know who's there, and then to decide on like who could take part, then that's where we could start. So for example, not just pushing for the government, but at the same time, how could we work around with local businesses to enlarge their capacity? For example, not just pushing to the supermarket saying, hey, you cannot use the plastics, but for example, working together with like restaurants and cafes who normally do not really deal with that sales, but to have their opportunity to share what they have as a stock for cooking, so that, for example, they can do package-free sales to local community perspective. So that's kind of matching is one way. Just to add, since you highlighted circular economy, in terms of the carbon emission reduction, actually the circular economy could contribute about to 50% of climate mitigation only by shifting that business model into this. So this is one perspective we should really look into that.
Yeah, which we will. But Tak, do you feel like your industry has a lot to answer for? It's packaging, it's bottles, it's things we consume.
Yeah, well, definitely, as we saw the screen, and we got to make an endless effort to reduce the plastics. But well, let me talk about the PET bottle because we are a beverage company. And definitely reduce. Definitely industry can do by technology, so that we can reduce the amount of the plastic to use to make a PET bottle. That needs technology. And two, definitely we can work with the government. We can work with the citizens so that we can recycle PET bottles. In that process, we can reduce the CO2 emissions. But we have to think about some aspects. One, environmental impact. Two, safety. Three, definitely CO2 emissions. And the environmental impact is ocean litter, for example. But every aspect, what is the the optimal option for us. And we believe, considering all the aspects, POT bottle is the answer to recycle, and definitely.
Taki, once you sell a PET bottle, how can you be so sure that it's recycled? I recycle, I live in London. I don't know where my stuff ends up. I don't know if they do it correctly. So how does a private company make sure that the public service does it correctly?
Well, as a matter of fact, it's not only by business, but also government and citizens. And the role of the government is very much important, but we communicate as business with the government. First of all, each party of the three parties has to bear responsibility. First of all, government has to raise the importance of recycling. And we offer innovation, technology, and recycling innovation. And the three citizens always think about the importance of the recycle. And I'm not saying that the business can resolve all issues. We all three parties have to work together as one.
Akira, do you see, do you see people recycling? Do you see, government saying they'll do one thing and actually do it? And not all of them even say they'll recycle.
Well, people has definitely an intention that they want to be good. So then, of course, to take part in that recycling if it's the right direction going forward. But as you questioned, we don't have the transparency. For example, like right now, new materials are coming in. Melati, you can highlight it later, that we have this biodegradable material, which we don't know what is the difference from the normal plastic. Well, conceptually we understand, but what do we do with this when we dispose? So if we are to introduce these kind of materials, then definitely we also need to have the system in place, what consumers or the general citizens can do.
For example, I saw a lot of the reusable, returnable glass bottles in this Davos so much, and they're replaced completely. But as a matter of fact, considering CO2 emissions, returnable PET bottle needs twice as much of the recycled PET bottle. That's a reality, and that's the real number. So we have to be realistic about numbers. And as I mentioned earlier, all aspects, we got to think about the real numbers, such as, plus we invent lots of new technology to reduce CO2 emissions in the process of the recycling.
Melati, how did you actually change the perception, all right, of people to go forward with your initiative? Who did you have to convince first, and what was hardest?
Well, so I think we had to work with all levels of society, and this is something that we really acknowledged, becoming one of the largest youth-led movements in the country. Education was at our core. So we really understood that we had to change the mindset because, for example, 6 years ago when we went into a local school, we would ask one simple question. And I remember this is one of the first presentations we ever gave. We were a team of 4 and we all had our scripts. We knew who was going to say what and when. But we opened with a simple question. Is plastic good or bad? And every single kid in the classroom raised their hand and said, "Ooh, pick me, because I know the answer. Plastic is good." And we were completely taken aback because this was so different than what we had imagined would be the answer. But it was simply because they had not been taught otherwise. Plastic was introduced. 20 years ago, Bali was still using banana leaves, traditional sustainable materials. Plastic was introduced without the learning of the consequence that it would end up in our environment. And so the perception of these kids was they go to the store, they take a plastic bag, they go home, they unwrap the food that they just bought, they burn it, and the plastic is gone. So education was a really key aspect to mobilizing and getting change happening. But it wasn't only the students that we had to educate. We had to educate businesses. We had to work and educate and learn with government. And I think this was one of the most frustrating parts, understanding as a young change maker, why? What were the challenges? Why is it taking so long? It should not have taken us 6 years to ban single-use plastic bags. So I think what I'm trying to say here is that we had to work with all levels of society. We had to educate, we had to learn, but now we know the facts. We know what we need to do. And still that there's a lack of, or a very big gap from intention and action.
Vice President, I'm getting a lot of questions, so please keep on sending your questions. And what's interesting is that the first one was, why can't manufacturers stop producing or using plastic packaging in their products? But then the last one is, what can governments do if companies do not comply with global targets for plastic reduction? So on a big scale, who do you have to tackle first?
Well, the economic system is broken in important ways. And one way in which it's broken is that the price paid for a plastic bag or a plastic bottle does not reflect the true cost to society of what you're purchasing. And so in so many ways, we are seeing the aggressive monetizing of the global commons. Cheap, destructive, extractive, exploitive business models that really rely on destructive practices that take advantage of the global commons without really caring about it.
How do you change that?
Well, governments have to step in order to impose a more accurate cost. And that can only happen if there is a sufficient awareness among citizens and sufficient pressure from citizens on governments. Now, in many governments around the world, including the one in my country, there is what is sometimes called a policy capture or regulatory capture, with wealthy industries that devote a lot of resources, lobbying, campaign contributions, revolving door strategies where their own people become the regulators. And as a result, the public interest is not reflected in the policies that are made. Now, in some other countries, there are different results. China just enacted a very impressive measure to ban single-use plastics. I hope they have more success with this measure than some other jurisdictions have. I rather expect they will.
Well, let me introduce about Japan. PET bottle, it comes to PET bottle, collection rate is 90%. And the recycle rate is 85%.
Jack, for people that don't know what a PET bottle is, so is it just a form of plastic that
for
you can
the
recycle?
beverage bottle.
Yeah.
Okay, and 90% collection, 85% recycle. That is because government, industry, citizen, we work together, and this already is happening.
Working well?
Right, working well.
Good.
And plus, we industry is now investing to new technology to reduce CO2 emission required to recycle PET bottle. And we completed the technology such as reducing as much as 30 to 40% comparing with the virgin PET bottle. So that means this is happening in Japan. I'm not talking that this can be employed to Indonesia soon, but I think this kind of innovation in an innovative way and the way to handle the PET bottle can be applied to some other countries like Indonesia. Maybe we have to alter fitting to the local context, but what about working together like Japan and Indonesia, Vietnam and Asian countries?
Yeah, what was really interesting was the government, the people, and the industry have to work together, and that's because there's incentives set in place, but there's also clarity within regulation. And this was something that was super challenging even in Bali, because, for example, our own government on an island-wide level didn't understand the autonomy that they carried to be able to enact a ban on plastic bags, for example. So how do governments know what the right hand and the left hand are doing? We have to make sure that governments have that clarity within their own regulation so that they're empowered to actually implement those, draw the line in the sand and provide that guideline for businesses to take action, where then citizens can apply their contributions to the community as well. So I think that is somewhere, and this is, again, the interesting part that young people play. We can connect those dots, and we can be those bridges as long as we're open to the discussion and ask the right big questions that are needed.
Akira, a question actually, which is, why is it that only 9% of plastics are recycled? Why is that? Is it because
In Japan?
You need local initiatives, or is it just because some of these plastics you can't recycle?
Right. So first of all, I'd like to challenge back the topics. Is that first, what is recycling? So we could put it back as a PET to PET, yes, that might be recycling. Or do we actually biodegrade everything going back to the earth? That is part of the recycling. But in some contexts, like recycling also as a term includes like waste to energy, which is it recycling? So we also need to question the numbers and definition of the recycling itself. And then, but to question
Well,
the
so, what
answer,
do you see, so what do you see, if you look at recycling, the best possible way of recycling, what would you do for it?
Well, of course, the circularity. So definitely the material goes back to either the virgin resources, which could be a chemical, or the material, but at the same time not to, let's say, down the quality of the material itself. So the circularity means like how many times it could continue to circular. That's one way. At the same time, also the second challenge I would question is that so comparison of, let's say, reusable versus recyclable. You mentioned about the CO2 emissions, but at the same time, like talking about the global level, national level, maybe you could have already the balance of, which is better, which is not. But breaking that into the local context, maybe that the narrative is totally different. So if you break down that, then we could discuss totally different models. So that's...
Thank you very much, very clear. Just a brief comment on one of the points you made is waste to energy recycling. I would say no, because the common burning of plastic puts poisonous pollution into the air and contributes to damaging forces for human health. It also adds greenhouse gas emissions. But make no mistake, there is a growth in strategies for dealing with this huge burden of plastic by burning it. And that's not the answer at all.
Yeah, well, as a matter of fact, I'd like to respond to your comments. We have an accord with amongst even competitors. And the PET bottle, for example, we produce 100% clear and non-colored. And always the label is detachable easily by a consumer. So this is an accord among competitors. I think we should do it globally so that we can, collect a good quality PET. Then we can, reduce the worsening the quality of PET. So every country, every competitor of our industry should talk about what kind of PET bottle we should produce. And this is industry accord. It's not regulated. This is, voluntarily, accord among the competitors. So that means among industry, we industry has to talk among the competitors for the better of the use of the plastics to society.
Melati, let me ask you, did anyone miss the products that were banned? Did you have to replace them with other things, or did you just do without them?
Yeah, so I think so there were 3 things, and this was an effort of everybody on Bali, of collaborators and partners, but it addresses 3 things: plastic bags, straws, and styrofoam. I think straws were already having a movement on its own where every time you went to a restaurant, nobody was drinking out of a straw anymore. So there are inventive alternatives, whether that's a papaya stem or just the old-fashioned drinking from the cup. And then the styrofoam, I think one of the biggest challenges here is the alternative because, for example, in the food industry or the fishing industry, there are different ways, and there's a lot of discussion on what actually are the alternatives. So I'd be curious also to throw that back to the panel. Plastic bags, we're seeing more people bringing their own plastic bags, just bringing it to Thailand, actually, where there was a viral social media campaign where when they banned plastic bags, people would go to the supermarkets with like the most strangest alternatives to carry their groceries. And I think that this is really where there's a movement. I mean, people are almost making fun of why haven't we done this earlier, how can we actually go back to empowering individuals to say no to plastic? But yeah, just to toss it back, what are some of the alternatives from breaking free from single use, right? I mean, bringing it back to the topic of the panel a little bit. What have you seen?
I mean, Jack, could you actually do without plastic? Would your supply chain work if you were tomorrow to go to the office and say, guys, that's it, we're stopping plastic?
Well, as a matter of fact, we're working on R&D. to replace the plastics, such as a biodegradable. But we are not sure about it might affect the ocean toward the dirty. We don't know yet. But what we have to do as industry is to find alternatives. We have to pursue that activity. As a matter of fact, we are working on it. I'm not saying plastic is the best solution forever. So industry is working on the alternatives. But at this moment, recycled PET bottle is the best solution from every aspect. I'm not saying again that's forever, but for the time being, and innovation is the key to resolve the issue.
Akira, you made a very good point at the beginning, is that actually a lot of these new technologies, we don't know exactly how they dissolve in the oceans and our Earth.
Right.
Is there a technology, or is it a measurement problem? Are we not looking at it, or have we just not had enough time to be able to measure it because they were invented years ago and we need to look in the next 20, 30 years what they become?
Right, the measurement itself is on the process, definitely catching up with what kind of technology or materials we have in place or getting into the place. At the same time, we also need to understand the different circles when we talk about the circularity. So for example, like bio part, which how much actually that's putting back the nutrition back to the soil or the earth, that's one point we really need to measure. Not just breaking down the plastic into nanofibers that will stay anyways. Versus we also need to look into how many times we could actually reuse or recycle, but stay in the same quality. So this kind of concept needs to be in place to actually setting all the measures. And then coming back to these alternatives, definitely our traditional way or traditional materials that we were given from the nature to be used is definitely the way we look into, which connects with my point of localization, because that's not like the mass production that we are looking into in terms of that kind of materials, and then we need to see what is the best for the local solution, while as a business, of course, you need to create a larger solution, yet we also need to look into the smaller scale of the models to test out and then see what's fitting into the context.
So, yes, Vice President.
Well, I was just going to add one point that there's supply and demand and reuse and recycling. We've talked mostly about demand, reuse, and recycling. I want to come back to the issue of supply, because we're now in the midst of business plans and strategies to double the global supply of plastic. And we just need to stop doing that. And I want to reemphasize the linkage of plastics production to the climate crisis. It is a major emitter of greenhouse gases. And just as there has been a mass public movement to block the construction of new dirty coal plants, and soon we're getting the same thing with natural gas plants, there is now the beginning of a mass public movement to block the building of new plastics manufacturing plants. And when you cut off the supply progressively, then that will give more incentive to come up with better materials and better recycling and reuse strategies.
Who do you think will be at the forefront of that movement? Is it a country?
Well, a lot of groups that will be in the forefront are environmental justice groups. And the new Poor People's Campaign in the United States of America, led by Reverend William Barber II, is one of those that is leading this movement. I'm joining with him. The Center for Earth Ethics is involved in this, and most of all, local communities. In Cancer Alley, there's a grassroots movement among these communities, largely African American communities, low income, who are tired of having these excessive and horrendous cancer rates imposed on them, and because they have not had the legacy political influence and power that people have a right to, they have been victimized. Environmental injustice is a pattern worldwide, and now there is an awakening among people who have been victimized, and they're the ones who are leading it.
Vice President, I think speaking about plastics, that is made of mostly petroleum.
Yes.
What about changing to the biochips? And in case, then we can reduce tremendously the CO2 emissions and
Sure, alternative feedstocks.
That's right, and we invented that technology already, and we need a lot, partners to produce, 100% plant-based PET bottle.
Yeah, but
that can be done.
I
already.
totally agree with you.
Yeah.
Here's the problem. We're seeing a shift from oil to gas. And the price of both are artificially cheap because they're subsidized because of policy capture. We have subsidies for carbon-based fuels at 38 times larger than the subsidies for renewables. And as we shift to gas, we see a higher mix of ethyl in the production, which makes it artificially cheaper to produce more and more and more plastic. So as long as that it seems to be the cheapest because the full cost of society are not included at all, then the market forces will continue to push in that direction. So absent a carbon tax, which, as I said, is difficult to impose, and absent regulations, places like China are doing it, the US should, some local and state jurisdictions will, then people power, demonstrations, opposition, and not just demonstrations, but the kind of very imaginative strategies that led to the closing of so many coal plants in the United States, cutting off the flow of funding, pressuring the investors, pressuring the stockholders, pressuring the boards, pressuring the parent companies. If they are consumer-facing companies, then they have their reputations to worry about. And if they're imposing high cancer rates and high pollution rates and poisoning the food chain with plastic, as we heard eloquently, if public attention is focused on that, they have to back off.
Akira?
Yeah. So when we start discussing about plant-based, there's one thing I would also like to highlight, that what is the chemical? So what is the other elements on top of the original materials? So that will, of course, lead back to the pollution, potentially, and all this toxicity coming out from the material itself on the production side. So how do we also make sure that's not happening when we switch the material?
So we have some of the results from the poll, so thank you for everyone who's voted. The question was, how likely are you to make changes in your own consumption habits or in the way your business or organization operates? 80% of you have said definitely, 13% likely, 7% uncertain. I mean, what are the 7% doing? What is the single biggest thing, and Melati, let me start with you, we can do to reduce the amount of plastic that ends up in the oceans? So what would you do?
Well, I think as individuals, we can think about our daily lives and our daily activities and see how we want to eliminate single-use plastics. And you don't have to do all of it all overnight, because that can be quite a big, ambitious goal. But you can start with all the small stuff that we see. So plastic bottles, bringing your own reusable bottle, or the next time you go to the grocery store, bring your own alternative bags. And then going out there, pressuring your governments, pressuring companies, and show them that there's a demand from the people, because so many times, and too often still today, we are hearing companies saying people do not want it, and governments are saying people are not ready for it. So I think we have a huge responsibility, and again, people power. We have to really step into this role and see the potential that we have to decide what ends up on the supermarket shelves. So use that power, use your voice, and see what changes will come out of it. You might be surprised.
Melati, I'm so impressed with you. I really. But on your specific question, Francine, about how to prevent so much of it going into the ocean, there are a lot of really good projects now focused on catching the plastic at the mouths of the major rivers, because most all of the plastic that goes into the oceans, I'm told, comes out of these rivers. And there are a lot of efforts now and there are efforts to try to collect it in the garbage patch. There's several of those, and I wish them well. It seems like a very difficult challenge. Yeah. But catching it at the mouths of rivers seems to be a...
Definitely. I mean, just on that note, 80% of the plastic that ends up in the ocean is coming from the rivers. Yes. Actually, in Indonesia, we have someone here, Riverman Gary from Make a Change. He's installing 100 trash booms across all the different rivers in Bali, and this is just one way how we can get involved, and there's so many around the world, and this is definitely a solution that's doable and replicable and scalable.
Akira?
Yes, so on top of what Melati mentioned, like, of course, we can start with ourselves as action, but on top of that, build a community. So it's not only about like, your friends, well, that's where to start with, but at the same time, engage all these other stakeholders, like local businesses, local shops, local government, of course, like not just to push them, but also how do we like make sure that they also can get on board, and then finding out and then mapping out what's the role they can take as a small scale of the community. But at the same time, use your communication skills, how to direct that questions, but of course, like to not to just point out the problem, but what they could do, and not to just change ourselves like individually, but how the systemic change would happen afterwards, after you communicate. So can I just give a small example? That, for example, like in Japan, more people are trying to ditch the plastic straw. So at the restaurant, people just leave it. But what happens after? They just throw it away. It doesn't change anything. So, but if you could at least communicate to the person who brought the straw to you and say, well, I don't need it, then what will happen? People don't want to be refused. So they will remember that, okay, some people are, not really want to use the straw now. Well, maybe that's a trend. And then if that happens twice, they will say, okay, from now on, I don't want to be refused. How can I, change how we offer? So they start asking, do you need it or not? So that's actually a systemic level of change, but can start with like ourselves, how we approach the community. So.
Tak, the plastic straw seems, something like, why do we even still use plastic straws? Is it to drink faster?
I'm sure that the currently huge reduction of use of the plastic straws, and we see, in hotels, in restaurants, and in Japan, and everywhere, in every corner of the many countries, huge reduction of use of the, plastic, straws, and there are so many devices to replace, such as some other materials which are good for environment. So it's already going on underway, and you see the huge change comparing with the between now and 2 years ago, last year, huge change. So we should be optimistic because people know we should not use the plastic for drinking of water, drinking a beverage. So we industry are not promoting to use straws, plastic straws. So it's done, I think.
Is it really changing?
Yeah,
According
it's
to Break Free
changing.
from Plastic, Coca-Cola is the world's biggest polluter of plastics, followed by Nestle. Does everyone talk? Do they really want to make a difference? Do they realize how many of their bottles are recycled
Francine,
and where they end up?
Very simple. We industry want to be liked by society. Otherwise, we can't survive. So that means, we want to be ahead. Well, we want to follow younger generations. That's the industry will. So industry has been changing quite a lot toward the less plastics and the better solution and the better replacement. That's what we are working on. So believe me.
Is this a generational shift, Melati?
I mean, just to build on that, I wonder, are we doing enough? Are we really doing enough? Considering the time crunch that we're in, I mean, a ticking time clock has started, and it's not something that we have to wait for goals of 2050. We need to see stronger goals happen right now. I mean, Indonesia, for example, to reduce 70% of waste by 2025. That's 5 years from now, less than it took us to ban one single-use plastic item. So we have to be realistic. We have to. Still, I think there's a lot of pressure. I think that there needs to be a lot more stronger commitments. And actually, to Coca-Cola, which was recently stated here, they're not going to change using plastic bottles because the people don't want to have changed from plastic bottles. So the question is, where are they getting that information from in the first place? Super curious also to know what they would need in order to change that perspective. What is it actually that companies want from us to hear and to be motivated to actually make the leap? Because I think that we do want that change.
We are not saying that forever. If there's a good replacement, we want to change.
Right.
Because we know, that hurts the ocean.
But, yes.
So we want to change, but for the time being, the POT PET bottle to be recycled, that's the optimal option. But if there's any, we are flexible, we accept. So don't forget.
Right. But just how much longer do we have to wait? It's definitely not a challenge of budget. It's definitely not a challenge of whether the people want it or not. So what is the bigger than us challenge and barrier that keeps companies from changing? That's what my question is. That's what my frustration is. I don't see why we're not moving faster.
You go, girl. Yeah. You go.
But Vice President, I want to talk to you because the government should take a huge role as well. Working with the industry and the government, you're not the outsider.
I'm a recovering politician. I'm not in
But yeah, to tackle such questions also from both sides,
yes.
It's again the pinpointing to each other, right? So to partner in that sense, of course, like we can't really bring up all this like specific ultimate solution, but like how do we partner in the local level to create a solution in the small scale, which companies also test out what they want to try out and see, what's the response. And then, hey, now you can say,
Exactly.
that's what we want. So this kind of like small scale is where we could start with.
Okay, so to build on the frustration of Melati, I'm just going to ask you one final question. You have one phone call to do today to someone who can make a difference on this. Who would that phone call be to?
Melati.
Akira?
Shall I say to the vice president?
And then to Akira.
Well, definitely first to the policymakers, that will be, of course, alternative, the fastest solution if they put that in place. Yeah, and to all the stakeholders in your communities to build on that.
So policymakers, is there someone specific? Is it your mayor? Is it your
In a
health
national
official?
level? National level, policymakers who would lead on the regulation building, definitely.
Tak, who are you calling today?
Well, policymakers and we industry together, and how we can communicate with the consumers, because we are always communicating with the consumers and working with the policymakers, and how to effectively communicate with the consumers. And I'm not saying that government is only the party to take responsibility. Even the citizens, and how to instruct what is the best way for for the society. We work together. So not only government, not only industry, three parties have to work cohesively, but the leadership is policymaker.
Just briefly, in the electronics industry, there is a big movement for companies to take responsibility for taking their used products and waste back. For really thousandths of a penny, we could imprint identification on these plastics and use blockchain to assign responsibility for the companies responsible for putting them into commerce in the first place, and then ask them to accept responsibility for bringing it back and disposing of it properly.
Yeah, just to add, media. They need to make all these narratives around this to show that it's actually the needs we have.
We need more Francines.
Okay,
Francine.
Melati, you're taking calls today.
Yes,
you're taking calls.
A quick phone call. I mean, we heard policymakers and industry already. So just to add a different coin or a different side of the story, I would pick up the phone and call the Minister of Education, because I still think that there's a massive education gap. And if people don't know what the problem is, how can they ever get involved in rallying, in demonstrating, in coming up with campaigns to better the policies, better the media stories? So that's who I would call, Minister Nadine Makarim. If you're up for a phone call, let me know.
All right, thank you so much. In closing, I would like to invite Kristin Hughes, Director of Global Plastic Action Partnership at the World Economic Forum, to just say a few words.
Thank you. Well, I don't know about you, but I thought that was a very energetic and, frankly, very entertaining panel. So, again, can we say thank you? A lot of really amazing insights here from a very diverse group. So thank you again. A couple of really important takeaways that I heard was that first and foremost, it's very complex, right? Was there not a very diverse set of opinions and ways we can attack this problem? The second bit was the time to act is now. Melati gave us a very clear call to action. Let's get on it, right? We need to act now. And the third is that there is a role for each of us in this. So throughout that value chain for plastics, whether you're using it as a retailer or as a bottler, but also for those of us as consumers, how do we actually attack this further upstream through our own consumer behavior, awareness, education, as well as downstream with innovation, investments, etc. So we are going to be looking at this from a very holistic and very diverse perspective. And I commit to you today, on behalf of the World Economic Forum, in line with our 50th anniversary, we will be approaching this utilizing stakeholders throughout the value chain, investors, technology, and everybody else. We invite you along on our journey to engage in us in a sustainable and cohesive way. Thank you again to the panel, and thanks to each of you for your work.